Hi, and welcome everybody to this panel discussion on the Cyber Resilience Act and open source software. We want to talk about what maintainers really need to know about the upcoming EU cybersecurity legislation. It's towards the end of Maintainer Month now. Throughout the month of May, GitHub runs a whole bunch of live streams and discussions on topics that are relevant to open source maintainers. And today's live stream is hosted by the Open Regulatory Compliance Working Group at Eclipse, and you'll learn more about what this working group does throughout our conversation. Many open source maintainers over the last few years have been concerned about the EU Cyber Resilience Act. They've been asking questions, and what we want to do today is to talk to policy experts, talk to open source maintainers, to hopefully help answer your questions about the Cyber Resilience Act, clear up some misconceptions, and maybe also give you some ideas why it's important to think about policy and where you can still get involved. I am Felix Reda. I'm the Director of Developer Policy here at GitHub, and I'll be moderating today's talk. And I want to take a moment to thank our different panelists and experts who will be joining the discussion. I have to note one absence. Unfortunately, Ashley Williams can't make it today, so it's just going to be the four of us. And I'll turn the floor to Toby to introduce himself first. Hi, Toby.
Hi, Felix. Thank you very much for hosting this panel. I'm very excited to have this conversation. So my name is Toby Langel. I'm based in Geneva, Switzerland. I run a small consulting agency focused on helping organizations with open source. I'm originally an open source maintainer, and I still maintain open source software too. So I do have this hat on, although it's less a part of my day job today. I am also involved in the OpenJS Foundation, but most of my relationship to the CRA right now is being the tech lead for the Open Regulatory Compliance Working Group, ORC, and working with other foundations and manufacturers and the Commission to help with the implementation of the CRA and help clarify the areas that are still nebulous and bring clarity to maintainers and to the broader ecosystem.
Thanks, Toby. It's great to have you. And next, I'll hand the floor to Daniel.
So hello, yes, I'm Daniel Stenberg. I'm a Swedish open source developer. I suppose I'm mostly known for having founded and I'm still leading the curl project. Yeah, we go back since until sort of late 1996. So, and I did open source before that too, I guess. So yeah, a long time open source developer, I think is safe to say. So yes, I'm of course interested in CRA from a sort of, yeah, from the open source perspective, what we need to do and how it's going to affect us and how we are going to make the best of this going forward. Thanks.
That's indeed the objective. And then I'm going to hand it to our third panelist, Martin.
Hello, everyone. So my name is Maarten. Thanks for having me on this panel, Felix. So I work for Nelnet Labs, which is a developer of open source software in the area of DNS and internet routing based in Amsterdam. We're a nonprofit. My role is not so much to develop the software, but to bring our expertise in these standards and software implementations to policymakers. And that's also how I got into contact with the CRA a while back.
Great. So we have the whole spectrum of positions from kind of policy to open source maintainers. And of course, we want to have a conversation with you in the audience as well. So please feel free to leave your questions in the live chat throughout the hour. And we'll have a Q&A session at the end of this call, but also if there are questions that we won't get to, the Eclipse Foundation is planning to publish a Q&A on the blog that you'll be able to check out later. And of course, it's also important to know, even though we are talking about how the CRA will affect open source developers and open source projects, of course, we cannot provide personalized legal advice to your project. So please keep this in mind, that we are doing our best to kind of explain what the CRA means and to counter misconceptions. But of course, there are also some elements of this EU law that are still undecided, and we're not judges, so we might not be able to answer every question with 100% certainty. But we'll do our best to bring a little bit of clarity into this topic, because I think it's important that not every open source developer should have to become a policy and law expert just to contribute to the public good. So with that, I want to jump right in, and I'm going to start with Martin, because you were one of the first, I believe, to raise attention to the Cyber Resilience Act in the open source community a few years ago. And so I would be curious, what is the Cyber Resilience Act, and why do you think it's an important topic for open source maintainers to care about?
Sure. So the Cyber Resilience Act is the European Union's attempt to introduce rules on its market for digital products, so hardware, software. And the aim of the people drafting this law is to raise the floor on security practices. So to make it, to raise, or to lower the number of vulnerabilities in software, basically. They try to do this for all these categories, like hardware and software, but they only put obligations on where software is monetized. And I think we'll talk about that later. But so it's a law for people making money off software. And the CRA, in the version that was published, has a nuanced approach with respect to free and open source software. So why care about this? Well, if you are making money in the EU.
Right. So from my perspective as not a maintainer, it sounds like a pretty good thing. I mean, if I'm buying a smartphone, that it won't be outdated and part of a botnet a few years or just a few months later. But I would be curious to hear from you, Toby, what the CRA means for open source projects. So there are lots of different open source projects, of course. You can be a company that's building a product based on open source. You can be an open source foundation, or you might just be an individual contributor. Will all of these have to comply with these new rules?
So a series of excellent questions here, and also I think a very sound comment at the beginning, which is, the purpose of the CRA is to improve cybersecurity of products that are sold to citizens, but also to businesses. And I think that in the concern that have been expressed in the early days of the CRA, we sort of lost touch with the fact that there is very strong alignment here with the ethos of the open source movement and open source maintainers to align with this idea that the tools that people use should be as safe as possible. And so I think this is really important to state. And I think the CRA not only states this, but also does something which is really important. It states very clearly that it is manufacturers, not open source maintainers, who are responsible for the security of the end product and the product that is placed on the market. And this is, very part of the open source licenses, right? It's the as is idea, the software is provided as is. And it's really important and really good to have the CRA text actually spell this out. And so to address your questions around who's impacted by the CRA, well, first of all, of course, the maintainers, the manufacturers, the manufacturers, the people actually placing the products on the market, they have a bunch of obligations. The CRA also introduces the notion of an open source software steward, which is a new construct in EU legislation, which essentially targets organizations, whether they are nonprofit, like an open source foundation, for example, or for-profit, who are not making money off of an open source software component that they're working on and that they're making available. So for example, obviously a foundation like Eclipse or Apache or the Linux Foundation will be considered as an open source software steward, but also a manufacturer, a company who has open source components that they're not selling, will fall in that category of having to be a steward for that open source project. And the obligations for stewards are fairly small and lightweight. They're very reasonable. And now, of course, the question is, are maintainers impacted, and are open source software contributors impacted? So contributors clearly are completely out of scope. So if you're just contributing to a project, you can essentially go do something else now. You're done here. On the other hand, if you're a maintainer, it really depends whether you're monetizing the project in different ways. And we're working very closely with the European Commission to make sure that we have really strong guidance coming out from them that describes in which cases you would fall under being considered as a manufacturer, so essentially liable to the full CRA, or whether you're completely out of scope.
I think that's important to highlight, that even though the law is adopted, it's coming, there's no way around it. But what does it mean to be commercial versus non-commercial? That's something that the European Commission still can give guidance on, right? And so how do you influence that? How does that look like? Like, what do you do with your working group there?
So there are multiple ways that we're working on this. One is that we have an FAQ, frequently asked questions, that is on GitHub that everyone can contribute to, and actually, like Daniel and both Daniel and Martin here, and yourself also, actually all of us have been working on this. So this is a place where we collect essentially the questions that everyone asks, or wonders about, and either point to existing answers in the legal text itself or in the recital, so that the beginning sort of introductory, very lengthy text that's in the CRA, or to other existing legislation, or when we are not sure, or when there are ambiguity, that we bring to the Commission for their input. And we can do this either directly by answering calls for input that the Commission puts on a regular basis, or through the CRA expert group, in which the Eclipse Foundation is a member, and which is essentially a group composed of representatives from all of the EU countries. So there's like 60 members in that group. So about half of countries, and then it's 4 or 5 that are open source foundations or represent open source, and the rest are more sort of industry. And through that group, we can also help bring those concerns directly to the Commission, and provide input on the guidance that the Commission is currently working on.
Right. I mean, that's great. So basically, any of you in the audience can access that FAQ, can look at it and figure out, what does this mean for me? And potentially, if there's a use case that has not been covered, also add it. So Daniel, how do you feel about this? Do you think the CRA is clear enough to know as a maintainer what you have to do?
Well, I have to underscore that this FAQ is really a key resource here to actually understand what the requirements and demands are for you and your project. So, and I don't think exactly as Toby mentioned here, all the details are not clear yet. And I mean, we already said, so if you're just a contributor here, you're clear basically. But if you're a maintainer, and I would say most maintainers are also sort of not burdened by this at all, because most maintainers won't make a profit or won't even make money. So they are also off the table. But there's this small group of maintainers then that are making money. And what actually does it mean? How much money do you actually have to make to have to comply, blah blah blah. So that's sort of where the questions I think still remain. But I think we're going in that direction, right? And the working group is doing excellent work there. So I'm sure we will come to a better understanding exactly, or maybe not exactly, but roughly where the lines are here in the sand. So we're certainly going there.
Right.
But I think
And
I think the key message is still exactly what Toby said. So that for most maintainers, it's an easy peasy thing.
That's reassuring. And I think getting this clarity, what it means, for example, if you're taking donations, is going to be really important, because most people who have GitHub sponsors turned on or some other micro donations, they might not know exactly how much money they're getting every month, but in a lot of cases, it might not be enough to cover all of their costs, right?
Absolutely.
Okay, so let's kind of turn to what this will look like in practice. I mean, the law is one thing, but then the other thing is, how are people going to react? So I'd be also curious to hear from you, Dania, because you have a lot of experience with companies using your open source project. And how do you think this is going to play out? Like, are companies that use open source going to become more responsible because the Cyber Resilience Act is forcing them to? Or do you think there are also risks involved in that relationship?
Oh, I think we're going to see changes in software, in the software landscape in general, because the CRA pushes a pretty strong responsibility to everyone who makes something, to all those manufacturers of products and services. So they are going to have to make sure that they stand on more solid ground, solid foundations. And when all these foundations are open source, they need to make sure that they use good open source, and they have to then help the open source projects to actually sort of be good, so that they can do those promises and stick to the CRA. So I think they need to help open source projects. I also imagine that I mean, we have a enormous spread in number of open source projects and number of open source projects used today. I will also imagine that some of them probably shouldn't be used anymore, in particular old legacy stuff that, you know, no one maintains since 13 years back, but they're still being used in products being sold for $20. And that's not a viable future. So I think the ideal situation is at least that we're going to see some help sort of from the users of open source products. I mean, as in the manufacturers who use open source products, and that we're going to drop some of the most legacy stuff that we really shouldn't be using anymore.
Okay, so let's say let's imagine I was an open source maintainer and I was doing this in my free time, sort of out of the goodness of my heart, and I receive a letter on very scary looking lawyer letterhead saying this is the law representation of company XYZ, and we're using your open source project, you're our supplier, please show us how you comply with the Cyber Resilience Act. How would you react to something like that?
Well, first of all, of course, it's a matter of, do I need to comply at all? If I don't make any money out of my project, I'm not a manufacturer here. I'm just a maintainer of an open source project. Then I don't have any responsibility at all like that. So, but the ones who are manufacturing something using my open source, they have a responsibility towards the law, right? So they have to make sure that they fix problems, and they should upstream their fixes to me then, if I'm the maintainer of that open source project. So of course, if I don't get paid, and a lot of companies are using my software and I'm not a manufacturer, I might still get a lot of feedback or a lot of patches. I don't know exactly how that will turn out, but we'll see. I think for most projects that if you're widely used by a lot of manufacturers, I mean, ideally you already want everything done correctly, you know, safely, securely, and appropriately. So we're already doing the best we can. I actually don't think it's such a big deal. So sure, I mean, I'm already doing a project used by billions of devices. So I don't see that as a particular threat. I see that as more of I'm an optimist here. I think it's a good thing. I hope that they will sort of help ensure that we do good stuff that they use.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting aspect that a lot of the things that the Cyber Resilience Act asks for, like, for example, having a vulnerability handling process, is probably a good idea for any project, but we don't want people to get punished for doing something that is in the public interest, right?
Right.
And Toby, you looked like you
Yeah,
had
no,
something to say
yeah,
on that.
I mean, I think it's really interesting, and it's being really part of like the whole implementation process, and you know, coming to talk about this was actual manufacturers. It thanks to Martin, really, that the open source community was alerted to the CRA so early on because, to be fair, the original versions of the CRA had really concerning impact on the open source ecosystem, which I believe have been mostly resolved in the final version. But as a result of like this initial sort of alarm bells that were thankfully raised, the open source community is actually much more aware and kind of like on the forefront of the CRA compared to a lot of the industry that's actually who are actually the ones who are targeted by it, right? And I think that we entirely forget that like the open source ecosystem as a whole has been very security focused for a long time, and that the real target of the CRA isn't curl, right? The real target of the CRA is like this really bad like security camera that you've purchased on like, you know, some online thing that is you know, has like a server included that uses like default 1234 password and is a huge security concern, right? This is like, those are the key targets today. I'm not saying that down the line it's not going to extend as, you know, as everything rises and security as a whole improves and cyber resilience as a whole improves. But right now we're very concerned, but yet we're like, you know, the first of the class kind of. And so I think it's also important to sort of like raise this dissonance. We're mostly going to be fine. That, on the other hand, and that said, I do also want to say that while a lot of most open source maintainers and you know and contributors are out of scope, the impact that this will have on the whole ecosystem will have second order effects, as Daniel was just suggesting right now, on open source and the way we develop open source. And also, I also very much agree with this notion that as manufacturers are now responsible for their whole software supply chain, they will probably and thankfully start looking a little bit more seriously as to the whole dependency trees and their transitive dependencies, and start doing a bit of cleanup there. And being on, you know, on the other end of that issue, for example, in OpenJS, where we have people still relying on very old versions of jQuery, a Lodash, a Node, etc. It's, I think, good that we're able to have legislation that pushes people to adopt like more modern and updated software, patch software. And now we can also focus the maintenance work on like the latest versions and not have this long tail of things that people rely on when they really shouldn't.
Right. So, Martin, I'd be curious to hear from you, since you have sort of accompanied the legislative process on the Cyber Resilience Act for many years. Do you think that attitudes among politicians about open source software have changed, or how come, like, what do you think was decisive why the Cyber Resilience Act somewhat changed for the better when it comes to open source?
So I think it's a hard question to answer, but I'll try. The Cyber Resilience Act was quite unique in the sense that it already contained references to open source when it was published. So the policymakers writing the proposal were already way ahead of many of their peers, in the sense that they had identified open source being a thing within the software ecosystem. And you have to imagine that the people writing legislation may not be domain experts in each of them. So the fact that these references were present, and there was a well-meaning intention to do something specific to open source was in there already. The issue, however, was in the complexity of this ecosystem with corporate involvement, companies, but also many individuals maintaining things, software in their spare time. So I think what was decisive was the manner and number of people reaching out to the European Commission, to the European Parliament, to their own national governments and saying, hey, the intent is great, but the way it's written right now risks affecting this pretty fundamental aspect of software. And they were receptive to that. And I think there were a number of national governments, my own in the Netherlands included, that were quite active in channeling feedback into the actual policy process. And likewise, the European Commission, I think, was very open to engaging with total random people from the internet, to summarize us. And I think that the law became better for it. So I think, so in terms of reasons, I guess it really helped that at some point the manufacturers, like the manufacturers of physical goods in particular, also spoke out that this would be a problem. So until then, it was mostly maybe people with a not-for-profit style or a foundational background speaking up. But after some time, the commerce angle also showed up, and had more or less the same story after they talked to their engineers. So I think that was like convincing from the substance, not so much from money involved or something. So I guess it was a good way of making public policy, even if it cost some of us a bunch of time.
Right. So no ill will probably from the side of the policymakers, but it was really a matter of kind of educating them. And I can also say from my own time in politics that when industry, civil society, individual citizens are all saying the same thing, that's usually a good sign that you might be onto something there. So I want to bring in some audience questions, and we have the first one. Let's see if we can bring it up on the screen. So Darvesh was wanting to know how the Cyber Resilience Act differentiates between a commercial software vendor on the one hand and an open source maintainer on the other hand, especially when they're contributing voluntarily. Martin, do you want to say something on that?
Sure. So in the case that you are merely contributing, it doesn't really matter whether you're a commercial software vendor or you're someone who does this in their spare time. Contributions to projects that are not your own, not on your own responsibility, are very clearly exempted. But if we look at not contributing but like maintaining something, then the keyword is really about monetization. So if you monetize this software in Europe, then you are likely in scope, though there are some exceptions for open source. If you do not, you're likely or you are out of scope. I don't need to say likely. So if you are monetizing for open source software, there's still nuance. So for example, if you are receiving donations, you can actually receive donations up to some point. And the guidance will be very specific about this, I hope. But I consider it quite likely that donations might actually cover your development work itself. We don't know yet, but that's very likely. I saw Simon in the chat also answering a question, which basically amounted to the same thing. So there's also other exemptions. For example, if you are a non-profit doing this, and the money you make goes towards your non-profit objectives, then it's also quite likely that you're not a manufacturer. You might be a steward, but you're at least not a manufacturer. And so that's the big distinction here. So I think that is the version that I'll give here. If you want to read a little bit more about this, I really recommend looking at the FAQ. I think there's 2 questions that talk about this specifically, and maybe they will be helpful to you.
And really, if you're making money and you are a maintainer, shouldn't you have most of these things already sort of in place? And then CRA shouldn't be such a big burden on you anyway, right?
Yeah. I think this is important to highlight also because more and more open source projects are also looking at the different grants that are out there. Like there's the Open Technology Fund in the US, there's Sovereign Tech Agency and NLNet grants in Europe. So to summarize, basically, if you're not making a profit, if you're not monetizing the software itself, even if you are getting paid from somebody for something connected to your project, that doesn't necessarily mean that you're monetizing the project, right?
No, I think that, yeah. And I think even if that's the case, it might be that there's useful stuff in a CRA to look into doing, right? But that's completely separate from whether there's a legal obligation upon you to do something.
Right.
What Daniel just said.
I realize we didn't say a lot about the obligations that are in the Cyber Resilience Act, but they do relate to kind of secure software development practices, vulnerability disclosure, things like that. But we do want to.
But I want to emphasize too that they are things that most projects want anyway. So even though, of course, the CRA has a stronger sort of requirements if you have to comply, some of them you want to comply with anyway if you're just a well-used sort of doing things correctly project.
And I think it's worth adding here to also to Martin's earlier point that the drafters of the legislation spent a lot of time educating themselves on software and are very smart and collaborative people that have done their homework. I mean, it's commendable. For me, like, sort of like coming into this whole policy world, to realize like how much work and how much dedication was done for legislation like this. And so the requirements in the CRA are very sound. Like they're not silly things. And I believe that the CRA, because it really targets the whole supply chain, is not going to lead to just sort of like checkbox compliance, but actually meaningfully, hopefully meaningfully change the cybersecurity landscape and deliver on the promise of like having more secure products and less cybersecurity incidents.
Right. I can still understand though why some open source maintainers might be concerned. Maybe their project became much more popular than they thought it would. And they're thinking about, oh, will I have to now provide a guarantee that this project will be updated forever? And so for that reason, I think it was important to also not treat open source projects the same way as manufacturers, right?
Yes. 100%.
Absolutely. But I think maybe the focus on if you're a manufacturer or not, maybe that I feel that we have that focus a little bit too much, because I think we are going to be affected as open source maintainers anyway. Even if you're not a maintainer, we're going to be affected. And I think that is going to be much bigger than if you're going to be a manufacturer or not, because most maintainers won't be manufacturers. I think we have concluded that. So that's going to be just a small minority of all maintainers. But many more maintainers are going to be affected just by the sheer fact of that so many of our users are going to be manufacturers.
Yeah,
right.
And I guess you could say that is affected in the positive sense, hopefully.
Yes, ideally, yes.
I think that's a good segue to our next audience question too, if we can bring it up on screen. So what should an independent open source project that is not associated with a foundation or some kind of open source steward expect from manufacturers? So I think this kind of goes to the heart of the question. So disregarding the question, is my open source project a manufacturer? It's probably going to be used by somebody who is a manufacturer. So what does that mean for a project if a manufacturer is using their project? What can you expect, like for better or for worse? I don't know if any of you wants to jump on that.
Sure.
Well, I'm happy to say one thing, and then I'll leave it to Martin. And the thing that I'm happy to say is that one of the messages that I've been hammering out to manufacturers is that most open source projects do not have stewards. So while there is, in the legal text, this concept of the open source software steward and a bunch of lightweight requirements on what they have to do, most manufacturers will have to learn to figure out how to do the same things with just regular open source projects. And so I think it's just like an important thing to state as the starting point. Like that's the norm, right? Independent open source project, that's the norm. And I'll leave it off to Martin to add.
No, this is definitely the point. I think 99.999% is not is independent and is not associated with a foundation or steward. So I like Salve's question. So what should they expect from manufacturers? Well, the manufacturers will have obligations. So if a manufacturer integrates your open source project into their product and ships it, asking money for it, they will have some responsibility going forward. And one of those responsibilities that you might notice upstream as a maintainer is that when this manufacturer finds a vulnerability in your code, they have obligations of fixing it in their product. They can't ask you to do that. They have obligations to do it themselves. If they fix it, if they ship a fix, they're also obligated to share their patch with you as a maintainer. Then as a maintainer, you don't have an obligation, but maybe this patch is actually good and you want to work with your downstream users to integrate it. You could also be involved before this, right? Perhaps you have a good relationship with this particular manufacturer and they are a contributor already. I guess that's not new. Those scenarios exist. So in terms of expectations, I think what will happen more often than it might happen right now is that you get a contribution from a manufacturer. I would hope because they have a vested interest in having maintained software, but definitely once the CRA goes into effect, they also have the obligation to contribute upstream their security patches. So that's a very specific thing. I think more generally, now there are obligations on manufacturers. This might actually incentivize them to spend a bit more energy on what they integrate in their products in terms of maintenance load and compliance load. So I for one hope that this is also a helpful support for an existing movement where large organizations realize the value of open source in their products and start thinking about how to engage with their upstream maintainers. But we'll see. I guess I can be hopeful and talk to me in a couple of years.
And I think it's important to remember that these manufacturers, they have really an incentive to make sure that the open source project actually merges my patch. If I'm a manufacturer, send my patches to the open source project. If I send crappy fixes that, yeah, they fixed my problem, but the project won't accept it, then I'm sitting with a problem long term, right? So the manufacturer has an incentive to actually make sure that they get their patches merged into the project so that they can get rid of that maintenance burden. So again, ideally, that'll be a good thing.
That's a really interesting aspect because I think we don't talk enough about this aspect of the Cyber Resilience Act, that it actually requires manufacturers to contribute their vulnerability patches upstream. And I was worried that it would be very difficult to enforce this obligation because you might not know. But that's a really interesting aspect, that it's actually in their own best interest to contribute their patches back, so they don't have to kind of keep maintaining their own their own
Yes,
fixes.
it'll be super expensive very quickly if they don't, because then they'll sit with all those patches themselves, and the next version bump, yeah, then they have a mountain of patches too. So yeah, they don't want that.
So there might even be some new contributors from the corporate world coming to open source projects because
Yeah.
they will be the ones responsible if things aren't working right.
Yeah, and ideally more kind of contract works and sponsorships of existing maintainers, because they are the ones who are best suited to do those fixes and do those things that these manufacturers need.
Yeah, on this topic, there is a concept of security attestations for free and open source software that has its own article in the CRA, and that essentially describes a mechanism that is still very much to be defined, and that we're very interested in at the ORC working group, and that we're working on a couple of white papers on the topic, and potentially specifications down the road. And the idea behind this attestation program is that, to Daniel's point, the best way of leveraging good and secure open source software is to have the maintainers, those who are knowledgeable of that software, actually build security in from the start. It's very basic, sort of like shift left kind of strategy, right? And you don't really have good incentives to do this, but the CRA not only brings good incentives, as Daniel was suggesting, for this, but it also potentially, through this attestation mechanism, can actually even create some kind of way to fund this security, and essentially enable open source maintainers and also other players in the field to create open source components that meet like most of the obligations that a manufacturer has, and exchange some kind of like financial support or resource support in exchange for that work. So still very much like an open and green field, but like clearly that's been thought about in the CRA, and we have instruments that we can try to play with and tune to possibly make this happen.
Right. So I think it's worth mentioning under the CRA in the future, software products are going to have like a CE marking. So they're going to be certified. But an open source project that is just a component, since the obligations don't apply to open source maintainers who are not monetizing, they wouldn't have the CE marking. So the idea with the attestation is to have something else that still signifies to a manufacturer this open source project is secure, it can be implemented, so that if you have 100 companies that are all using the same open source project, not every single one of those companies will have to start from scratch when it comes to assessing, is this open source project secure? So that could actually be like, if you want your project to be used, it might be good to get that attestation once it exists, right? So that it will actually be easier for companies to use your project if that's your goal. So let's go to the next audience question. So can you share any examples of maintainers taking action based on the CRA already that they didn't necessarily need to do?
So this is a question that is kind of hard to answer because we don't have full information, right, on the people taking action. But there was a pretty early example of someone who basically read the CRA on their own and freaked out because they felt they would need to support this project beyond their ability to. And I'm not sure if that was the interpretation I would have given to the situation. But then again, I'm not this person, right? So what it showed to us as people working on this, on trying to make this policy accessible to other people, what it showed to us is the need to do this type of session where we say, yes, we asked your attention for the horrors in the CRA 2 years ago, but also most of these issues are fixed in the legislation that was actually published. So if and when you are worried, make sure you use up-to-date resources to learn about this and not go back to some of the blog posts that we wrote 2 years ago because they may not no longer be accurate. So I don't think it serves very much purpose to name the specific example. But yeah, people are worried sometimes, and it makes a lot of sense because you do this maybe as a passion project, and then you fear that it becomes something that you cannot sustain. But yeah, please use up-to-date resources. The CRA FAQ of the org working group is great. You can also look for the CRA course by the Linux Foundation, which is also pretty good.
All right, we have quite a lot of questions coming in, so we'll try to get to all of them, but if not, there will also be the Eclipse blog post. So Stefan is asking, are open source projects impacted the same way if they are mainly based in the EU or outside of it?
I think this is also pretty similar. So the biggest change is, so first of all, let's assume that in both cases you ship to the European market, because if you don't, then we're done. Then you're not affected by the CRA. But assuming you do, if you are in the EU, it's a little bit more clear which surveillance authority, like which national regulator is responsible for you. So then it's clear. If I'm in Netherlands, the Dutch one is responsible. If you're in the US, it's not super clear which one is responsible. But this only goes for manufacturers. So if they really want to know, they can just open an office somewhere, and then it becomes really clear really quickly. So yeah.
What you say there about the regulator is also, I think, important to know, because like you might imagine that, oh, if I don't follow the CRA, I might get sued by somebody else, but this is not how this kind of legislation works, right? So there's a regulator who is in charge of basically making sure that the law is followed, and they of course also have priorities, which are probably the botnets made up of fridges and not necessarily your open source project.
And can we also just briefly add
please.
here, the fines are, there are no fines for stewards, right? And also, I think micro enterprises and SMEs are mostly exempt from the fines. So if you actually, even as a manufacturer, if you actually like don't do this properly, the authorities will tell you what you're doing wrong and will you give you time to fix it, in particular if you're a small player. So it's also worth like not entirely panicking. Like the goal is like not to like hit people with a stick, right? It's to improve like the outcome for the EU citizen and the EU market.
Right. Okay, let's go to the next question. Gina wants to know, what if I'm a full-time maintainer funded 100% through donations? Are my living expenses, etc., my costs? Is it okay to also put back something for when I'm old? I would feel punished if that was a problem. Yeah, this goes to the question of the guidance, right?
I'm going to take this. This is still unclear, but we're working very hard to clarify this. And I am optimistic and hopeful that we'll be able to answer a question like this positively in the near future. So hopefully the answer to this will be yes. Right now, it is still under discussion and being worked by the commission. Worked on by the commission.
Yeah, so I think two things we want to achieve there. One thing, arrive at reasonable rules that don't punish maintainers. And also, I guess, keeping the bureaucracy low. Like nobody should have to account very in great amounts of detail, like today I worked this many hours on my project and so on. So I think these are really good questions to also bring back to the European Commission, to like, how does this work, or how is this expected to work in practice to make sure that people who are maintainers will not have to worry about this.
And I also want to just inject there too, that we have in the FAQ and the issues there are like 22 other questions, very similar to this, when people have different setups. Well, what if I earn this amount of money and this amount of money, and I have a private company, this company, blah, blah, blah. There are so many different setups that you can earn money, little money, much money. And is that monetizing? Do I make a profit or not? So back again to what Toby is saying, there needs to be some more guidance exactly how to interpret everything. And everyone who is sort of thinking about these questions, we need to go back to the FAQ once in a while and see what we end up with, because there's a lot of unknowns here in the gray areas, and a lot of different questions and different setups. So yeah.
Yes, so excellent question to raise. Let's go to the next one. We have about 10 minutes before we wrap up. Proprietary software vendors sometimes release their less popular products under an open source license in the hope that the open source community will continue to maintain and develop the product. Do you think this practice will suffer under the CRA because vendors fear being held liable under the CRA in the long run, even if they no longer monetize the product themselves? That's an excellent question as to kind of what are the likely consequences, if not the intended consequences of the law.
This is also something that a few of us have flagged for clarification. So if you're a manufacturer and you maintain something, not to monetize it, but just to provide it on the side, maybe you should be a steward instead. And the CRA, as written, talks about this, but it could be more clear if how this works. A similar example is, suppose you make software and you sell it to some people and you give it away to some other people. In that case, does one thing apply to everything, or is it like a per transaction style? And I think that's being worked on in the guidance. I'm hopeful that obligations will attach where money is being made, which is kind of what makes sense. This is also how the NLF, which is basically the template for this legislation that already existed before, how it works. But we'll see. I guess the specific angle to this question was about maybe software that is no longer being maintained, and I would hope this is being treated the same way.
And even if they no longer monetize, that's not a question either, right? Because they have to support it for a number of years after they monetized it.
Yeah, I think so. For products that they have sold, it's pretty clear. So they have to support those.
Yeah, exactly.
But I guess this question is about if they at some point stop monetizing and they provide it for free afterwards. And then I guess we would be back to what I
was. If it's a service thing. I was thinking more like a router that you give away the source code to.
Right. So I don't think giving away the source code gets you out of the obligation to provide security fixes. And I think that's great because we have too many routers with which would really appreciate some patches.
Indeed. Let's go to the next question. Maybe we can do 2 or so more. Where does the open source community see themselves in the next decade? Are the existing open source platforms still going to remain open source, or are there going to be new developments that could cause the idea of open source platforms to change to a monetized platform? That's a question probably bigger than the CRA, but I would be curious to hear.
Can I first just say that there's no contradiction between open source and monetization? Sort of, that's part of the entire conversation here, right? That we want to monetize open source as well. So. But of course, I don't think any one of us can answer for the open source community and where that will be in 10 years. I mean, the open source community, when I talk about open source to people, I tend to say that there's really not an open source community. It's just a bunch of people, and we're all different, and we're participating in different projects for different purposes, and we're all just, so there's not just one single community. But from my own personal opinion and thinking here is that, of course, we have just increased open source use and in products and everywhere for the last decade and for the last several decades, actually. And I think we're still going in that direction. I don't see any sort of lesser use of open source going forward.
Yeah, neither do I. I think there's going to be some small adjustments for sure, but nothing massive. And I believe other sort of like larger things, like for example, the usage of LLMs, are going to have a much more impact on what the landscape could look like than the CRA.
Okay, let's bring in one more audience question while we have the time. I maintain open source security tools as a student and beginner. Will the CRA apply to solo developers or small GitHub orgs like mine that don't take donations or sell anything?
Great
think-
question. No.
No.
That's what we can
You're good.
answer very quickly, so you should be fine. Let's take one more then. If we have a support contract to maintain our open source project, but do not otherwise make money on it, does that still count as monetization?
So this is a bit harder to answer, but so if you have a non-profit entity that does this, then then you're likely okay, because the whole point is that if you are not for profit, and you have not-for-profit objectives, then it's okay to fund those using monetization. If you're like a natural person, then if those support contracts are not beyond the costs you're making, then you should also be fine, because there's a specific example in the CRA as written that covers this. If you make a lot of money on your support contract, much beyond what it costs to maintain, then you might be a manufacturer. But I think this might also be an angle that is clarified in the guidance. So I think you're in luck in that sense. And I'm personally also interested in this because the foundation I work for is partially financed, or maybe mostly financed, by support contracts. So we'll learn together.
All right.
That camp as well.
Yeah, so this will definitely be one of the things to watch out for. By the way, this guidance is probably going to come sometime over the summer, right? Because we mentioned it so much. Do we know anything about the timeline?
We do not know anything about the timeline.
We don't know, but they're working on it. So that's great. And the CRA is not due until the fall of next year, the first bit. So I'm pretty confident that it will be there long before then.
That is reassuring to know. Okay, we have 3 minutes left, so I think we're going to have to move to kind of final words and wrap up. I would like to know from each of you, and starting with Dania, if you have one piece of advice to maintainers when it comes to the Cyber Resilience Act or kind of dealing with laws in general, what would that be?
Don't panic, it'll be okay, and read the FAQ.
And we will bring that up in a minute. And Martin, what do you think?
Yeah, I'll expand a little bit on the don't panic. So if you heard that the CRA will have a large negative impact on free and open source software, your knowledge may be outdated, as you've probably understood during this hour. I think we did a good job, and as a community, to advocate, and the CRA changed substantially between what they first proposed and what was published as law. So many of the panicky alarmist blogs, including some of mine, are no longer an issue. So follow Daniel's advice, don't panic, and go to the FAQ.
Thanks nevertheless for writing them. And Toby, your chance to give advice and I guess also tell people where they can learn more about the org working group.
So I think the last thing I would want to say, because I strongly second what both Martin and Daniel said here, I think it's the most important part. The last thing I want to say is that the implementation of this area is not finished. And we can really help shape and iron out the wrinkles of this legislation in the next 3 years, and possibly create some really, really good outcomes for open source and the security of software and open source software in general as a result. And so I would strongly encourage people who are interested in this to join ORC. The working group is on GitHub. Most of our work is on GitHub. There's also a mailing list, and we welcome everyone to join and contribute. And I think it's an excellent place to not only learn more about what's going on, but also really advocate for things that you believe in and that need to be cleared. So yeah, please come and join us. It's also, frankly, like super interesting to have sort of like a front seat in something of that magnitude that is being unrolled, and that will impact the way like we all build software and contribute to open source in the future. So yeah, join us.
Okay, thanks a lot. That's a great final sentiment to end on. I would like to thank the three of you, and I hope we can also bring up the link for the org working group. Otherwise, it's orcwg.org, and there you can learn more. So let's leave it at that. Thank you all for joining me for this conversation and for wrapping up Maintainer Month with me. And see you
Thanks for
soon.
having us.